You clicked this video because somewhere inside you, you already feel it. The strange, quiet suspicion that knowing yourself might not be as peaceful as everyone says it is. Carl Jung spent his entire life studying the human mind, and what he found about self-knowledge wasn't comforting, it was terrifying. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. But here's the question that stopped Jung cold, the one that changed everything he thought he understood about the human psyche. What if the deeper you go into yourself, the more dangerous it becomes? Not dangerous to others, dangerous to you. What if the very act of knowing who you are carries a cost that nobody warns you about? That question is what this video is all about. Jung believed that most people walk through life wearing a mask. He called it the persona. It's the version of you that goes to work, smiles at neighbors, says the right things at the right times. And here's the thing about that mask. It's not fake in a dishonest way. It's just incomplete. It's a simplified version of who you are, built to fit the world around you. Most people never look behind it. And honestly, Jung said, most people are probably safer that way. The mask keeps the peace. It keeps the world from getting too complicated. The problem is that the person wearing the mask eventually forgets it's a mask at all. But some people start to look. Maybe something painful happens. Maybe life stops making sense the way it used to. Maybe a relationship falls apart, or a dream dies, or they just wake up one morning feeling hollow in a way they can't explain. And they start asking the question Jung considered the most important and most dangerous one a human being can ask. Who am I, really? That's where the journey begins, and that's where things get complicated very fast. Jung called this process individuation. It sounds clinical, but the idea is simple. It's the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are beneath the mask, beneath the roles, beneath everything you were taught to be. And Jung was clear about one thing from the very beginning. It is not a comfortable journey. It is not a journey that ends with you feeling better about yourself in an easy way. In many cases, it's a journey that breaks you open before it builds you back up. Here's why. When you start to truly know yourself, the first thing you run into isn't your strengths, it's your shadow. Jung described the shadow as the part of yourself you've spent your whole life pretending doesn't exist. Every angry thought you buried, every selfish impulse you refused to act on, every dark feeling you were ashamed of, every version of yourself that didn't fit the person you wanted to be. You didn't get rid of those parts by ignoring them. You just pushed them underground. And underground, they kept growing. The shadow is not your enemy. That's the most important thing to understand. It's a part of you that never got to speak. And the more you've suppressed it, the louder it eventually becomes. Jung actually believed the shadow contains something valuable, not just darkness, but unlived potential, energy that got locked away early in life because it wasn't safe to express, or because it didn't match who the people around you needed you to be. So you sealed it off, and the seal held. For a while. Consider a composite profile based on well-documented psychological patterns. A person who is known by everyone around them as generous, patient, and kind. They are the friend who always shows up, always helps, always puts others first. They genuinely believe this is who they are. Then one day, something cracks. Maybe they're betrayed by someone they trusted completely. And what comes out isn't just sadness. It's a rage so deep and so cold, it frightens them. Where did that come from? They had no idea it was there, but Jung would have known. That rage had been building in the shadow for years. Every time they swallowed their own needs to take care of someone else, it added to the pile. They never knew themselves as completely as they thought they did. And when the shadow finally spoke, it was deafening. This is one of the central dangers Jung identified. The gap between who you think you are and who you actually are doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It widens, and the wider it gets, the more destructive the eventual confrontation becomes. Jung saw this pattern play out, not just in private people, but in historical figures as well. He was deeply interested in the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche had an extraordinary mind. He could see through the false comforts of society, through religious myths, through political theater, through the social agreements people make to avoid hard truths. His perception was remarkable. His writing was electric. And yet Jung believed Nietzsche made a critical mistake. He confused seeing clearly with knowing himself. He became so identified with his ability to perceive the truth in others that he never fully turned that same clarity inward. He never integrated what Jung called his inferior function, the side of himself that needed warmth, connection, and humility. The result, according to Jung, was psychological collapse. Not because Nietzsche was weak, because he was brilliant in one direction and completely blind in another. The shadow he never dealt with eventually consumed him. Now contrast that with the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart, another figure Jung studied closely. Eckhart had a perception every bit as sharp as Nietzsche's. He could see into spiritual and psychological realities most people couldn't access. But Eckhart didn't wield that perception as a weapon. He channeled it into compassion and service. He didn't stand above people and declare their blindness. He knelt beside them and offered light. Jung saw in this a profound conscious humility, the ability to carry extraordinary insight without being destroyed by it. Eckhart integrated what he saw. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. Nietzsche didn't, and the difference in outcome speaks for itself. This contrast points to something important. Knowing yourself, in Jung's view, is not a destination. It's a relationship, a dynamic, ongoing, sometimes painful relationship with the full reality of who you are. And getting that relationship wrong can go in several directions, each of them dangerous in its own way. The first danger is what Jung called inflation. This is what happened to Nietzsche at his worst. When you begin to see things others don't see, when you understand yourself and the world at a deeper level than most people around you, there is a very seductive trap waiting for you. The trap of believing that your perception makes you special, superior, chosen in some sense. Jung warned about this with tremendous seriousness. He called it identification with the archetype, the moment your small personal ego starts to believe it is the deeper wisdom, rather than simply having access to it. When that happens, the person stops growing. They stop learning. They start preaching. And eventually, they become the very thing they once could see so clearly in others, rigid, blind, and self-righteous. The sad irony is that this trap tends to catch the people who genuinely did start with real insight. The inflation isn't a lie that replaces the truth. It's a truth that curdles because the person couldn't stay humble in front of it. The second danger is isolation. This one is quieter, but just as corrosive. As you begin to know yourself more deeply, you often find that you see things other people aren't ready to see. You notice patterns in conversations that others miss. You sense emotional undercurrents in rooms that nobody else seems to feel. And when you try to share what you see, people often don't want to hear it. They dismiss it. They get defensive. They call you negative or too serious or too intense. Over time, if you're not careful, the gulf between your inner world and your social world grows so wide that genuine connection starts to feel impossible. Jung described this as one of the heaviest costs of deep self-knowledge. The person who sees clearly becomes, in a very real way, lonely in their clarity, not because something is wrong with them, but because most people are simply not interested in that level of honesty about the human condition. And that loneliness, if it's not managed carefully, can tip into bitterness. The person starts to resent the very clarity that set them apart. They begin to see their depth as a punishment rather than a gift. And at that point, the shadow starts speaking again in a new form, this time wearing the face of superiority. The third danger is the one Jung considered most serious, and the one most people never see coming. He called it identity dissolution. This is what happens when the process of self-examination goes inward so far and absorbs so much from the unconscious that the person loses their grip on who they actually are. This isn't a metaphor. Jung himself experienced this. Between 1913 and 1919, after his painful separation from his mentor Sigmund Freud, Jung went through what he later described as a confrontation with the unconscious that nearly destroyed him. He was flooded with visions, dreams, and psychological material so intense he genuinely feared he was losing his mind. He documented all of it in what became known as the Red Book, a private journal he kept during those years. He wrote later that the only thing that saved him was his ability to stay grounded in his daily life, his family, his work with patience. The unconscious, if you open the door too wide without any anchor, can swallow you whole. And here is the part people don't often talk about when they romanticize the idea of deep inner work. Jung wasn't just describing abstract theory when he wrote about identity dissolution. He was describing something he lived through. The man who gave us some of the most powerful ideas in the history of psychology nearly lost himself in the very process he later taught others to navigate. That fact matters. It means the danger isn't hypothetical. It means the process demands respect. Not fear, but respect. There's a difference between courage and recklessness, and Jung learned that distinction the hard way. That experience shaped everything Jung went on to teach about self-knowledge. He didn't emerge from that period saying the journey wasn't worth it. He emerged saying the journey requires something very specific, not just courage to look inward, but structure to hold what you find. So what does that structure look like in practice? The first thing Jung taught is discrimination. Before you can integrate what you find inside yourself, you need to be able to tell the difference between what actually belongs to you and what you've absorbed from the world around you. This sounds simple. It isn't. Human beings are social creatures. We pick up emotional material from the people around us constantly. We absorb the anxieties of our parents, the expectations of our culture, the unspoken fears of every room we walk into. Most people walk through life thinking that their inner emotional world is entirely their own creation. Much of it isn't. Part of the work of self-knowledge, according to Jung, is the painstaking process of sorting through your inner life and asking, honestly, which of these thoughts and feelings actually come from me? Which ones am I carrying for someone else? And which ones did I pick up so early in life that I never questioned whether they were actually mine? That sorting process alone, done honestly, can take years. But without it, everything else you think you know about yourself is built on a shaky foundation. The second piece is shadow integration, and this is the heart of the whole endeavor. Integration doesn't mean accepting everything dark about yourself without judgment. It means acknowledging that every quality you see in the world around you, every quality that irritates you in others, every cruelty or dishonesty or weakness you notice and react to strongly, lives somewhere inside you too. Not necessarily in the same form, not necessarily acted out in the same way, but the seed of it is there. And the reason it triggers you so powerfully when you see it in someone else is precisely because you haven't made peace with it in yourself. Jung said this plainly. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. That's not a pleasant idea, but it's one of the most practically useful things he ever wrote down. To illustrate how this unfolds in real life, consider a narrative illustration built from a type of case that Jung encountered repeatedly in his clinical work. Someone comes in who spent years being the reasonable one in every conflict, calm, measured, never the one who raised their voice or lost control. They wore that identity proudly. It felt like strength, but under examination it became clear that their calmness wasn't always genuine equanimity. Sometimes it was suppression. Sometimes it was fear of what would come out if they ever stopped being reasonable. The shadow in this case wasn't anger alone. It was the deeper belief that their emotions, their real emotions, the messy and inconvenient ones, were too dangerous to let anyone see, including themselves. Working with that took time, but when they finally sat with it, when they stopped performing calm and started feeling it genuinely, something shifted. They became less brittle, less easily threatened. The mask they had worn so long became optional, which meant it finally became real. That transformation, that shift from a mask worn out of fear to a self inhabited with freedom, is what Jung called the individuation process, at its most honest. And he was clear that it never fully ends. It's not a problem you solve once and then move on from. It's a relationship you tend for a lifetime. There will be periods where you feel you've made genuine progress, and then something will happen, a loss, a crisis, a moment of failure, and you'll find yourself face to face with a part of yourself you thought you'd already dealt with. That's not failure. That's the process working exactly as it should. The unconscious doesn't hand over its contents all at once. It reveals them in layers, timed to your capacity to bear them. This leads to something Jung observed that most people in the self-improvement world never talk about. The people who are furthest along in genuinely knowing themselves are not the people who seem most put together. They're often the people who've been most broken open, the ones who've lost things they thought defined them, the ones who failed in ways they couldn't explain away, the ones who've sat in the wreckage of a version of themselves they no longer recognized and had to rebuild from scratch. That kind of experience is not comfortable to look at from the outside, but Jung believed it was often exactly what was required. The ego, the everyday self we manage and present to the world, has to be humbled before something deeper can emerge. He wrote about this in a way that still cuts right to the bone. He said the most terrifying thing in the world is to accept oneself completely. Think about that for a moment. Not the most painful thing, not the most difficult thing, the most terrifying. Because real self-acceptance, the kind Jung was talking about, isn't the kind that shows up on motivational graphics. It's not being kind to yourself on bad days or forgiving yourself for small mistakes. It's looking at the full reality of who you are, including the parts that are contradictory, the parts that are selfish, the parts that are afraid, the parts that have caused real harm to real people, and not looking away. That is terrifying, and it is also, Jung believed, the only path to becoming genuinely free. But here's where something shifts in an unexpected direction. Because Jung didn't just identify what makes self-knowledge dangerous. He also identified what makes it worthwhile in a way that goes beyond personal healing. Jung believed that when a person truly knows themselves, something changes not just inside them, but around them. Their relationships change. The way people respond to them changes, not because they become easier to be around. Actually, in many cases, the opposite is true at first. People who are more genuinely themselves tend to make others slightly uncomfortable, because authenticity has a way of holding up a mirror. When you stop performing, the people around you who are still performing can feel it. And some of them won't like it. Some relationships won't survive the process. Jung was honest about that. He never promised that individuation would make your life simpler. What he promised was that it would make your life more real, and he believed that was worth more than simplicity. To see this dynamic clearly, Consider a case profile drawn from the patterns Jung observed across many years of clinical practice. A person arrives who has spent decades shaping themselves entirely around what others needed them to be. Every role filled with dedication, every expectation met. On the outside, everything looks fine. But inside, there is a growing numbness, a sense that they have been everywhere except inside their own life. When they begin the work of genuine self-examination, the first months are disorienting. The identity they had built with so much care starts to feel less like home and more like a structure someone else designed. Some relationships strain under the pressure of their growing honesty, but what replaces the numbness is something they had no name for before: presence. The simple, startling feeling of actually being in their own experience rather than watching it from a distance. That feeling, Jung believed, is what every human being is unconsciously chasing. Most people just look for it in the wrong places. Now here's where the tension reaches its peak, because there is a final paradox buried at the center of everything Jung taught about self-knowledge. And this is the part that most people never reach, because it requires surviving everything that came before it. The paradox is this: the more deeply you know yourself, the less certain you become. Not in a defeated way, in a liberated way. The person who truly knows themselves stops needing to be right all the time, because they understand that their own perceptions are incomplete. They stop needing others to validate their experience, because they've developed a real relationship with their own inner world that doesn't depend on approval. They stop performing. They stop defending. They stop competing in the small, exhausting ways that consume so much human energy. And in place of all that noise, something quieter emerges. A steadiness that doesn't need to announce itself. A presence that doesn't need to prove anything. Jung saw this in the people who had done the real work. They were not perfect. They were not without struggle. But there was something in them that felt settled in a way that most people, no matter how confident or successful, never quite achieve. Jung taught that if you can hold the warring opposites inside yourself without forcing a premature solution, something remarkable happens. If you stay with the tension, a new perspective eventually emerges on its own, one that couldn't have been reached by logic or willpower alone. Jung called this the transcendent function, the emergence of a unifying attitude from the unconscious that bridges what seemed impossible to reconcile. To be uncertain and steady at the same time, to be flawed and still at peace, to see clearly and still choose compassion. Getting there is not a smooth road. The danger of self-knowledge, the real danger, is not that you'll find something monstrous inside yourself. Most people, in my view, find something far more manageable than they feared. The real danger is the cost of the process. The relationships that can't survive your growing honesty. The identities you'll have to let go of. The comfortable stories about yourself that won't hold up under examination. The gap between who you thought you were and who you discover yourself to be. That gap can feel, for a period, like falling. But Jung spent his entire career arguing that the falling is the point, that the dissolution of the false self is not a catastrophe, but a necessary passage. And here is what I believe, having spent years studying his work. Jung was right. The danger is real, the cost is real, and the reward is also real. Not the reward of becoming some idealized version of yourself, the reward of finally, genuinely showing up as who you actually are, of not spending your energy managing a gap between your public self and your private one, of having relationships built on something true rather than something performed, of making choices from your actual values rather than from fear of how they'll look. The world has no shortage of people who are successful by outside measures, but hollow by their own. Jung's work is not a comfort for people who want easy answers. It's a map for people willing to pay the real price of self-knowledge, which is giving up the version of yourself you built for protection and discovering the person who was there underneath it the whole time. That, at the end of all of it, is what Jung meant by knowing yourself. Not a project completed, but a life lived from the inside out. A commitment renewed every morning when you choose honesty over comfort, awareness over performance, and the hard work of being real over the easier work of being liked. If this landed with you, if something in here touched a real question you've been carrying, drop a comment below. Tell me where you are in this process. Tell me what part of yourself you're still learning to look at honestly. Even writing it out truly helps you. And if you want to keep going deeper into Jung's ideas about the hidden forces that shape who we are, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. This is only the start. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.